So, the UMP. First introduced to the Counter-Strike series back in 1.6, the UMP was released with rather underwhelming results. If I remember correctly, the old UMP used to cost too much, fire too slowly, and in general was fairly weak in comparison to most of the other SMGs in 1.6. Since then, the UMP has been pumping some serious iron, and has since transformed itself to become the strongest SMG in CSGO. So what exactly do I mean when I say the strongest SMG in CSGO? I'm sure most of you can guess, but of course to elaborate, we first need to review some weapon statistics. Like always, I won't be covering every single statistic, but just the ones that I feel that are important and or interesting. As my second SMG breakdown, I'll do my best to try and avoid rehashing statistics used in previous videos, but obviously some will need to be recapped. With that said, to start us off at $1,200 American, while not the cheapest, the UMP is definitely one of the cheaper SMG options with a $600 kill award, and is available for both terrorist and counter-terrorists alike. As many of you have probably guessed, or already know, the UMP boasts the highest raw damage per bullet out of all the SMGs in CSGO. At 35 damage per bullet, the UMP's flat damage statistic is actually close to that of the AK-47s, but then again, so are most of the pistols in CSGO. Of course, one of the key differences being armor penetration. On that note, at 65%, the UMP's armor penetration is excellent for an SMG, being only second to that of the P90s. Combine those two statistics together, and I think it's fair to give the UMP the title of strongest SMG. However, like most weapon or even character archetypes, the strongest are usually some of the slowest. True to form, at 666.6, the UMP is in fact the slowest firing of all the SMGs. But, to be fair, in comparison that's about the same fire rate that most standard rifles use. Plus, the slow rate of fire does seem to help with ammo management, considering the weapon only holds 25 bullets per magazine. Still, the slower rate of fire definitely hinders the weapon's overall lethality. But, surprisingly, even taking rate of fire into consideration, through sheer strength, the UMP manages to boast the highest damage per second against unarmored individuals, and the second highest against full armor. Of course, in CSGO, raw damage isn't everything, as we still need to consider other variables like inaccuracy statistics. So, as you would expect from a submachine gun, the UMP has rather standard SMG inaccuracies, leaning more towards the inaccurate side of things. In addition, as the strongest SMG, the UMP also maintains the highest weapon recoil magnitude at 23 units. Now, that may seem intimidating at first, but surprisingly the UMP spray pattern is actually one of the easier ones to learn in CSGO. With relatively low recoil variance combined with a slower rate of fire, the UMP spray pattern follows a near vertical line, drifting ever so slightly to the left and back right near the end of its cycle. While mastering said pattern is easier said than done, for the most part in CSGO, sprays requiring mostly vertical compensation are much easier to manage than those with excessive horizontal drift. That, and considering the UMP is commonly used as a close-ranged weapon, managing the spray pattern becomes even easier. Which brings me to my next topic, on how to effectively use the UMP. So before I give you my interpretation, I remind you to take my explanations with a grain of salt, as there are many factors that influence effective usage. Things like skill level, playstyle, and current meta, to name a few. Anyhow, as SMGs in CSGO were intended to be quick-hitting mobile weapons, it is strange to see a slower, relatively hard-hitting SMG. Now, while you certainly can run and gun with the UMP, as it still maintains decent mobility and running inaccuracies, I wouldn't actually suggest using it in that fashion, depending on the situation. Personally, I consider the UMP more of a CQC rifle, rather than a true SMG. How I mean is that it's typically more effective to shoot while stationary, as the damage and armor pen allow you to competently compete with rifles in CQC aim duels. Now, while gun jumping and gun running can be effective at times, because even the worst SMG moving inaccuracies are far better than most rifles, unlike the MP9 or P90, you don't have an amazing rate of fire to consistently bail you out when spraying and praying. Plus, with the longest SMG reload time of 3.5 seconds, you really need to make those 25 bullets count during a firefight. As an SMG with the lowest rate of fire and longest reload time, I would say that the UMP is less effective against multiple enemies. Which leads into my next topic. So, when should you buy a UMP? Well, customarily the classic meta option is to use the UMP as both an eco and anti-eco weapon. But, to be honest, nowadays I prefer using it almost exclusively as an eco weapon, and I'll tell you why. While undoubtedly the weapon is lethal on both defensive and offensive sides of the eco, I would argue that it's potentially too good at what it does best, presenting more of a risk to your team when purchased as an anti-eco weapon. Let me explain. Reflecting on the aforementioned statistics, it is my opinion that the UMP specializes in winning CQC duels. Yes, while the new popular meta encourages buying pistol full armor, and the UMP is certainly effective against armor, you have to factor in the increased probability of engaging multiple enemies at close range, which is not an advantage the UMP has over other SMGs. Ordinarily, when a team is forced to eco, they either attempt to stack a site together, or at the very least play for trades. This affects both T and CT sides, as it's a common strategy to make up for the lack of firepower by increasing manpower.
What am I supposed to do?
Normally, it's somewhat acceptable to lose a farming SMG against anti-eco rounds. With the close proximity of shootouts and the expectation of upgrading in the next round, it's a calculated risk-reward. However, with just how effective the UMP is at winning CQC duels, dropping one to the enemy team can really be just as bad as losing a P90, or even a rifle. Again, the same statistics that make this weapon great as an eco weapon work heavily against your favorite in anti-eco rounds, especially if the enemies are fully armored. Keep in mind that even if you win the round, you are still susceptible to significant economical damage if too many of your teammates are killed in the previous round. That's part of the reason why I suggest and prefer using the MP9 or MAC-10 for anti-eco rounds, as they can be just as, if not more, cost-effective while presenting less of a risk to your team. I know some of you may be thinking, well, for anti-eco rounds, what about using the UMP at longer ranges? Surely playing further back would help mitigate some of the disadvantages. While yes, that is true, the UMP is not a cost-effective weapon for engaging targets at longer ranges. Let's put it this way, with the high amount of recoil and firing inaccuracies that come with the UMP, I think it's fair to say that tapping, or maybe bursting, would be the most accurate way to engage enemies at longer distances. In doing so, you negate your biggest advantage of firing speed, as most popular eco-round pistols have a higher armor penetration, longer effective bullet ranges, and somewhat better ranged and accuracy statistics. Against full saves, I'm still of the opinion that the MP9, MP7, and even the MAC-10 fare better all around. In conclusion, the UMP is a very strong gun for the price, combining SMG mobility and accuracies with rifle class damage statistics, for CQC at least. However, in terms of usage, the same advantages that make it great as a 1v1 eco weapon can also be applied as disadvantages for many anti-eco situations. As much as the UMP would like to be a full-fledged rifle, its statistics just come up a little short.
What does the scouter say about its power level? It's over 9,000! What?
Bicycle. Bison. B-zone.